The goal of this lecture series is generally to raise public understanding of legal issues essential to human well-being and to improve skills to engage in public debate and advocate for better implementation and enforcement of human rights and humanitarian law both in Canada and globally. The lecture tonight is about human rights, the development of human rights and humanitarian law, the laws that developed after World War II, the conditions that made those reforms necessary, and the ideals and individuals that shaped the law. And now I'd like to introduce our lecturer. Clair L'Heureux-Dube, formerly a justice on the Supreme Court of Canada, is an extraordinary Canadian woman, lawyer, judge, and human rights advocate. Since 2002, when Claire retired from being a judge on the Supreme Court of Canada, she's continued her advocacy, but she's expanded her territory. She now works full-time, always on a volunteer basis, doing human rights advocacy and education around the world. After Claire retired from the Supreme Court of Canada, she became a director of Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada. As a director and member, she has been a source of ideas, encouragement, good advice, and hard work. She has shared her time, experience, and knowledge with a singular generosity. Tonight, she is now going to share some of that knowledge with you. So could you please welcome Claire?
I would just like to give you a background and an overview of how this body of law we call international law has developed through the decennies and hundreds of years. Since the world is world, the desire for peace and justice has inhabited the hearts of all human beings and has been the goal of most, if not all, nations. The means to achieve it is what human rights is all about. Different civilizations and countries have at different times tried diverse ways to achieve this goal. They look at the best means to settle their differences. This is the case, for example, of equality, which meant different things to different civilizations in different periods, but was and still regarded as an essential condition to achieve peace and justice. The French Revolution is an example of inequalities which brought about the revolution of the masses in search of justice. And inequalities bring wars. They bring revolutions. We know that. So that's one way of achieving peace. In order for countries to achieve peace through mostly commercial ends at earlier times, treaties were concluded, and the notion of a law which would apply between all nations in case of conflicts emerged with rules which eventually formed a body of laws which became known as the law of nations. Jus gentium, we used to say, and is now what we call international public law. This is different from international private law, which deals with conflicts of, mainly conflicts of laws between different jurisdictions. But the international body of law was built up with the treaties and from time immemorial. So international law regulates relations between nations and has its own tribunal, the International Court of Justice, to which nations which accept its jurisdiction do litigate their conflicts. The law of the sea is a very good example where a number of conflicts, some involving Canada, were brought before the International Court of Justice. There has to be some arbitration or arbitrate people who are able to solve problems with nations at the international level. Those of you who study at UBC probably know the JESA competition, which is a way to interest students to international law and how to settle conflicts between nations. The advent of the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations, the signature by all nations, or almost, of the Universal Declaration of the Right of Man, as well as the recent creation of the United Nations of by the United Nations of International Criminal Courts for War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, all originate from a similar desire of nations to achieve peace and justice at the international level. At the national level, new constitutions were inspired by the Universal Declaration. It's the case of South Africa. There, it's a 10-year-old or 12-year-old constitution. India, 60-years-old constitution, and of course Canada, for that matter, were modeled with various differences, perhaps, on the Universal Declaration. In our charter, we find word for word some of the articles of the Universal Declaration. So the influence of the Universal Declaration is incredible and immense, and all for the purpose, I repeat again, to bring justice and peace through the respect of human dignity of people. Rather, they translate it in songs or whatever, love rather than guns. Well, that's the idea, basically. The notion of human rights and humanitarian laws as we know them today, whose aims are still to achieve peace through justice, is not really a novel one. It has diverse sources. It seems to have evolved from natural law, writings of eminent jurists and humanists, to eventually gain mention in some treaties, which would guarantee, among others, the right to freedom of religion. That's in 1713. That's the Treaty of Utrecht. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 abolished slavery. The Treaty of 1842 between England and US, and the Labor Rights 1906, to mention only a few, as well as the Hague Convention in 1899 and 1907, and the following convention for the protection of war prisoners and some civilians in armed conflicts, which are now known as humanitarian laws. So, however, in this is a long story of treaties, and the treaties were to end wars, but they also, at times, included protection for human rights, protection for prisoners, for humanity, and so established this body of law. However, in this part of the world, there is no doubt that the Magna Carta of 1215, the Petition of Rights of 1627, the Bill of Rights of 1689 gave citizens of the United Kingdom more protection than any country had at the time, and it is said to have inspired the American Bill of Rights in 1776, which in turn was instrumental in the French Constitution, La Déclaration des droits des citoyens, liberty, equality, fraternity, which of course terminated the French Revolution in 1789. So this is the general background, how we came to what we have today from what developed in the decennies and siècles before. But both the First and the Second World War, with their genocide, atrocity, misery, and I could go on, were great incentives for the incorporation of human rights protections into international treaties and conventions. The Treaty of Versailles, for example, in 1919, which terminated the First World War, incorporated the Covenant of the League of Nations, which guaranteed freedom of conscience and religion to subscribing nations, as well as, and I quote, fair and human labor conditions. That was in the Traité de Versailles. 1919. Other treaties with Eastern Europe, nations in particular, signed at the same time or later, went even further in guaranteeing the right to life, freedom of religion, equality before the law, and against anti-Semitism. It is, however, the horrors of the Second World War which were the prime motivation for the adoption of more specific guarantees of human rights in treaties. The Atlantic Charter, signed by the US and the UK in 1942, was to be, at the time when the US started to take part on the Second World War, was to be the prelude to the creation of the United Nations Charter in 1945, and the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1948. When I say the rights of man, of course, it's the right of men and women and persons. So there was finally political will to establish a system of international relations based on the respect of human rights. Both President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, of course, and even Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the commission charged with the drafting of the Universal Declaration, which was called La Commission Consultative des Droits de l'Homme, I prefer to keep it in French, because that's my main language, have this political will to establish a system of international relations based on the respect of the rights of, or the respect for people, in fact, had achieved what was to become the heart of the human rights laws as we know them today. The purpose of the Universal Declaration is unequivocal in its goal of peace and justice. And I'll read its preamble, one of its. It reads like this. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want, has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Very clear. We want peace and justice through respect of human rights and guarantees that their rights will be respected. So it's important because I have sometimes the impression, reading the papers, that human rights has become a word like feminism, perhaps, that, you know, is kind of a fancy or something. But when you know what it means really for the world, it is incredible that we may not be convinced that it's what we're doing is trying to achieve peace and justice in the world. So human rights is not a fad. It's not something that will pass. Human rights is really what will guarantee us peace through justice when it's implemented in all its dimensions, which is not, it is not today, unfortunately. But we have to start somewhere. Some progress has been made. So I think that we have to remember the purpose of the Human Rights and Universal Declaration. Now they needed. It was good to have those ideas. It was wonderful to have a charter, but they had, in order to have the countries, they had to have a place to meet. So it started with the League of Nations, and I mentioned that paradoxically wars were the prime movers behind the search for peace through the agreement of nations to develop a system that would ensure peace. This was the case during peace negotiations after the First World War. War brings peace, and it's kind of paradoxical that at the time of war we were looking for agreement of nations to develop a system that would ensure peace. This was the case during the peace negotiation after the First World War, which concluded, of course, by the Treaty de Versailles in 1919. So at the preceding Paris Peace Conference, the same year, 1919, the Constitution of the League of Nations was adopted as a means to ensure collective security. Its main objective was for countries which ratified the covenant at the time to agree to resolve their disputes by arbitration under the threat of economic sanctions against countries which would resort to war. The Traité de Versailles also established the ILO, International Labour Organization, as an arm of the League of Nations, which still today is the international body which deals with the rights of labor and working conditions under the United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations. At the time, the headquarters of the League of Nations were in Geneva with a Secretary General. There was a British man, I think Sir Eric Drummond, who was the first Secretary General. They had a General Assembly, the Council, and the Secretariat. The Council had 4 permanent members, to date has 5. Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, which eventually rose to 9. With other elected members by the General Assembly every 3 years. That was the League of Nations. Some countries joined later, but some left. Of note, the US, which didn't sign the Traité de Versailles, did not join the League of Nations. So the League of Nations achieved some successes to preventing wars in countries such as Greece, Turkey, Poland. There were all kinds of skirmishes between these countries and their neighbors at the time. And the League of Nations achieved some success in preventing such wars. But probably its greatest challenge came in 1938 when Germany threatened to invade Czechoslovakia. And we all know Neville Chamberlain and met Hitler in Germany. And the purpose was to avoid a war. The rest, of course, is history. And the League of Nations, which was unsuccessful to prevent the Second World War, didn't meet during the war, and after the war, it devolved its responsibilities to the United Nations. So that's the first meeting place. We get to the United Nations, the second meeting place, and the idea of United Nations came to light during World War II as a result of an alliance between the United Kingdom and the United States, before the United States joined the UK in the war against Germany in 1942, and signed the Atlantic Charter, said to be the brainchild of Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. The idea for United Nations was endorsed in further Allied conferences during wartime in Moscow, Cairo, Tehran in 1942. There was a number of meetings to try to pursue that idea and see how it could work. So during 1944, a number of meetings between France, China, UK, US, the Soviet Union were held. So although its purpose was also basically to avoid war, it went much further than did the League of Nations in that it included the protection of human rights. Roosevelt, in its State of the Union address at the American Congress, had made clear that the proposed United Nations organization would be based on 4 essential freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, which all are reflected in the preamble of the Universal Declaration, to which I referred earlier, and the principles it enunciates. So the Charter of the United Nations was adopted in San Francisco in 1945, which created the Commission of Human Rights of the United Nations, which was headed by Eleanor Roosevelt. It led to the adoption in 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, with 48 member states voting in favor and 8 states abstaining. And the 8 states that abstained were Soviet Union, Belarus, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, just to give you an idea of the states that were, they didn't vote against. There was no vote against, but they were abstainees. United Nations was originally known as United Nations Organization, UNO, but it became the UN. Today, 192 states are members. That's my latest research of the United Nations.